for the planning process from the Bar Foundation and from the United Way, and implementation from them and from the Boston Foundation, and the participation of civic, from community-based organizations across the city has been extraordinary. And the Boston Indicators Project, which is a collaboration between the city and the Boston Foundation, will measure all of our outcomes to see if what we're doing, what we think is right, that can be measured, is right. That's another kind of collaboration that we have. And so sometimes the instigation for these comes from the city, sometimes from an academic institution, sometimes from a business, and sometimes from a foundation. The way to make these succeed is to do these collaboratively. When in the past there's been a gotcha kind of mentality to embarrass any one of those sectors, it has not worked. It has not worked. It can work in the short term, but it doesn't work in the long term. And that's come from all three sectors in the past. But when the engagement is to produce a result that everybody agrees is really important, there's no one of these sectors that doesn't agree that we want every child to develop to their fullest potential. But sometimes one or the other of the sectors has not really seen how important this is. So the last thing I want to talk about is how we see this collaboration going forward. And Barry already described it so well that I will not say much of what I was going to say, but when we think about the advantage of these institutions, organizations, and businesses being in Boston, we think of a few things. We are a relatively small, big city. There are 620,000 people in Boston, far more than the Census Bureau said there were, but we've proven now that there are 620,000. It is possible, actually, to get things done in Boston. It is possible to look at a neighborhood, to look at a sector, to look at a problem, to look at a population, and say, we really can't solve this. We're not New York or LA or Houston that is so vast, it's really hard to wrap your arms around it. But also because we have these very strong institutions, these three sectors that we can work on. So that's the first thing, when people recognize that you actually can do something. Secondly, we believe that almost everything that we think will benefit the people of the city is a benefit to those other sectors. When we talk to businesses about doing more job training and more education and more recruitment of people in the neighborhoods and more on-the-job training and raising people up inside their institutions, we are not asking them to do what is a nice thing to do and good for society. We're saying to them, when you can hire people, recruit people that live close to you, your recruitment costs are less. When you can hire people who look like and speak the languages of and understand the culture of your customers, you're going to do better. You're going to make more money, you're going to have better products, you're going to be able to think about the effects of your drugs on different products, whatever it is, you are going to do better. This is not charity, and this is not just public service. This is actually in your great interest. Barry talked a little bit about the universities, how much universities have to learn from engaging with communities. I think that is underestimated all the time. Not just, the city is not an urban laboratory to be done to or looked at, but to be engaged with, so that students and faculty and researchers will do better, will learn more, will understand more, and will be more competitive than those from other cities where they don't have that kind of engagement, where they don't have that kind of relationship. We think that true engagement with the city, whether it's John Hancock, who at the request of the mayor years ago started a summer jobs program for youngsters. It came out of the community affairs office. They hired youngsters to come in during the summertime to work at John Hancock. Within 2 years, John Hancock switched the funding of that program to its managers at their request. Because what the managers of the different departments found is how wonderful these young people were, how much they benefited the company, not just in the work they did, but in the manager's greater understanding of a different population, a much greater population. So it is not, when we try to engage businesses and not-for-profits into doing things that we believe are good for the city and its people, we are mindful always that it must be good for the institution and the organization. But we believe that we can do that. And I think that's one of the great lessons for leadership in Boston.
As Barry said, I'm the former president of Northeastern University. I think he invited me here in my capacity as the former president of Northeastern University to talk a little bit about kind of a new model of a private university that I think is emerging here and is emerging around the country. And I'm thrilled at the opportunity to do that, but I also have to acknowledge that Commissioner of Higher Education, and in that capacity, I am, of course, responsible for our community colleges. So I have to pause at the beginning to say that I appreciated Judith Kurland's remarks on this topic, which I have heard in many other places, and just to be clear, I completely share the goal of improving the graduation rates and the overall student success rates of our community college students, as do I think my fellow presidents in the community colleges. And I know we have a very long way to go on that topic, and we are, in fact, at the moment engaged in an effort to identify aspirational goals on exactly that point and commit our institutions to pursuing them in an aggressive way with the strong support and urging of the Board of Higher Education. So there is work to be done here, and we are far from where we need to be, although we are not that far from what other community colleges are doing around the country. That said, there is also much more to the story as to what our community colleges are doing, and the study that my good friends at the Center for Labor Market Study did, and the things they said and did not say, and the comparisons they made and did not make, and the qualifications that they made and did not make, all of which added up in what I think was quite honestly not a great example of research, at least as it was played out in the public dialogue, but rather a simplistic characterization that failed totally to take account of many, many complexities in the situation. I don't say that to be defensive about the community colleges. I begin by acknowledging that we have important work to do and we are setting goals, but I don't personally think that public policy discussion was a high point of responsible research, at least as it was played out in public. And I would also echo Judith's points that the key to solving this issue is not a gotcha mentality or a finger-pointing mentality, but a spirit of collaboration, which we in public higher education are very ready to engage in with Mayor Menino and the city of Boston. That said, let me do what I was invited to, which is to talk about what I think is an absolutely fascinating development in American higher education, which this university, Northeastern University, is very much part of. And that has to do with the emergence of really what is, I think, a new type of institution, a new type of university, which is a high quality, selective, academically ambitious, private institution, nonprofit, independent institution that is national in its ambitions and its reach and its admissions of students, but at the same time is deeply embedded in the life of its local community. This is something new under the sun in American higher education. It is quite revolutionary. Leading example of this type of institution, I'd say the University of Pennsylvania, perhaps most prominently, a Case Western Reserve in Cleveland, University of Southern California, in Los Angeles, and as I mentioned, I think also Northeastern, which I'll talk about more toward the end of these comments. I'd like to do three things in the course of these brief remarks. One is, for those of you who are not kind of inside the academic world, provide a bit of an overview about why this is so revolutionary, what is so striking about it. Secondly, summarize a bit the major characteristics of this type of institution. And then third, cite some examples from Northeastern to illustrate what I mean. So a bit of how we got from where we were to here. Universities, as you know, grew out of monasteries. They grew out of the religious tradition in the Middle Ages. They begin with the monastic tradition, and therefore they begin with the disposition to separate themselves from the world around them. That is where the notion of the ivory tower comes from. That higher education, the cultivation of the spirit, the cultivation of the mind, proceeds best when one is removed from the hustle and bustle of daily life, and most particularly urban life. And so when Great Britain is building its great universities, it doesn't build them in London, it builds them in Oxford and Cambridge, away from the urban center. And that tradition of separation, reflecting the monastic history, comes across the Atlantic with the settlers, and Harvard is founded separate from the city of Boston, explicitly not in the city of Boston, so that students and scholars can concentrate on their real work, which is cultivating their spirit, developing their religious sensibility, and not be distracted by the flesh pots of the city. And that tradition, carried forward from the Middle Ages, remains very strong in higher education right into the 19th and indeed into the 20th century. Where did we found our great, what we call AntiFellow Colleges, colleges before the Civil War? Williams College, Amherst College, out in the boonies. Why are they out in the boonies? They're out in the boonies for the same reason that Harvard was not at Boston. That's where educators at the time thought that education could flourish. Not in the city. The city was the enemy of the kind of reflection, the kind of spiritual cultivation that higher education was all about. In the 19th century, some exceptions, some breaches in this notion of the ivory tower began to develop. I think this is familiar territory to the land grant movement, which produced Massachusetts Agricultural College and agricultural colleges all over the country, and also engineering schools, including in its own way MIT, began to connect higher education more with the world around it than had ever been true before. That's a distinctively American development. And it began to posit this notion that maybe actually the intersection between a university and the world around it could be a positive thing. In the early 20th century, we started to get urban private institutions. Northeastern comes out of that tradition, the YMCA, education for urban, immigrant, low-income, working people so that they can get a leg up in society. Simmons College grows out of that tradition. Suffolk University grows out of that tradition. And then in the 1960s and 70s, we had the tremendous expansion of urban public institutions like UMass Boston, where I spent 22 very happy years, deeply engaged with the life of this city. So over time, beginning in the late 19th and continuing into the 20th century, universities started to move into urban settings, but they moved into them through low-status, unselective, service-oriented institutions that largely serve the local community. Commuting students, modest academic aspirations, non-selectivity. At the top of the pyramid, the old ivory tower tradition was largely preserved. The great example of this, for those of a certain age, my age, I think the great symbol of this is Columbia University in New York, on Morningside Heights, right up on the top of the cliff overlooking Harlem, which was completely divorced from the city around it, completely divorced from Harlem around it for generations. Its notion of urban development was to buy up the neighborhood, move the neighbors out, knock down the old buildings and take it over, the old kind of urban renewal mentality. An enormous bitterness built up between Columbia and the surrounding community for that reason. And so when Columbia tried to do something which I think they thought was a good thing, build a building that would have a gymnasium in it with access to the Harlem community, all hell broke loose. because there was so much bad blood, so much ill feeling that the students at the time at Columbia picked up on, and it was echoed in the feelings of the Harlem community. Harvard, our beloved Harvard University, is another example. If you think of the relations between Cambridge and Harvard, it's not exactly a history of collaboration between partners. It's a largely, and Paul was the vice president, so he knows the story better than I do, but I think it's fair to say, correct me if I don't say this accurately, I think it's been a largely adversarial one, at least in its history. The city of Cambridge not perceiving Harvard as a partner, and Harvard not perceiving itself as really having a whole lot to do with the city of Cambridge, other than the fact that by the accidents of history, it happens to be there. Nathan Pusey in the 1960s, you know, when we were all starting to think about cities and the excitement of getting engaged with it, Nathan Pusey was lamenting the fact that Harvard was being called upon to deal with all this stuff. He talked about the clamoring outside the gates, evoking that ivory tower monastic image. I happen to think there's a lot of, you know, Nathan Pusey was a wonderful man in many ways, but he did partake of that tradition. So you had continuing well into the 20th century, well into our lifetimes, well into the late 20th century, at the top of the pyramid, this tradition that universities should have nothing to do with all that. They should be separate from that. That's where the best form of education happens to occur. On the city side of the equation, there was, I think, a kind of a reciprocal ambivalence, if not ill feeling toward universities, which reflected a couple of things. One is the fact that universities, of course, are not taxed in this country. They take land off the tax rolls as they expand, as institutions and universities are wont to do. They take more land off the tax rolls, and Boston is not a large city, and so all these universities, and as they expand, that can't be a good thing for the city, can it? And besides that, they bring all these kids into the neighborhoods where people are trying to live decent, law-abiding lives and raise children. And on Saturday night, or Friday night, or in more recent times, Thursday night, all hell breaks loose in these neighborhoods. The neighbors call City Hall and they complain, and that's not a good thing either. So cities have tended historically to view universities as not necessarily engines of development or great partners, but rather as maybe something to be tolerated, but institutions whose presence was associated with real problems. So the history against which we're talking is a history in which, on the university side, there was a spirit deeply embedded in the institutional culture of separation and isolation. And on the city side was ambivalence and sometimes even antagonism toward the presence of these institutions in the civic midst. Two things in the late 20th century, I think, started to change this in significant ways. The first was the profound deterioration of our urban centers and the threat that began to present to some of our top-tier universities. Consider the University of Chicago, right next to one of the toughest neighborhoods in Chicago. Or consider Yale in New Haven, one of the most troubled urban cities, old urban centers in New England. Both these institutions began to see at a certain moment that if the pattern of urban deterioration around them continued, their future as what they were, elite, selective, successful private universities, was at risk, that they needed to engage, and they began to engage, and they've engaged in wonderful ways. The great example of this, I think the leading example of it, is the University of Pennsylvania, where deterioration of West Philadelphia, where Penn is located, was greatly advanced. The neighborhoods around Penn were dangerous, troubled neighborhoods. When Judith Kurland became president of that institution in the early 1990s, early in her administration, a Penn student was shot walking on the sidewalk near the campus. And one of her first meetings with parents was, are our kids safe at the University of Pennsylvania? How can you tell us, Madam President, that it's safe to send our kids here? She writes about this in her book about the transformation of Penn. It was a real wake-up call for her, that Penn's ability to attract the kind of students it wanted to attract was at risk. We couldn't let the deterioration of the city progress any further, and so Penn started an effort that began with the transformation of the neighborhood around it and a degree of gentrification, to be honest, that involved working with the neighborhoods to clean them up, to make them safer, to light them better, to bring in public safety, to bring in more effective retail. A case study that actually was quite collaborative with the neighborhood in how you can revitalize the neighborhood around the university physically. And as that happened, Penn began to get the point that there were actually tremendous positives for the university as a university, not just by making it safer and stopping the deterioration, but as an educational institution. For example, Penn, as part of this effort, started to develop internships and connections with the local community and discovered that the students loved this stuff and that it enriched learning in the undergraduate program. And Penn is now a center, it has an endowed center called the Netter Center, devoted to connecting the undergraduate curriculum at Penn with internship opportunities out in the city. They discovered that faculty members actually liked the idea of getting engaged with this work in West Philadelphia. They could enrich their scholarship in many ways, in many different disciplines. So gradually, Penn moved from doing something out of necessity to embracing the notion that being in Philadelphia was a positive thing. And over time, Penn has embedded itself in the life of that city in a completely different spirit, a true spirit of partnership that simply wasn't there historically at Penn or in other institutions around the country. So that, at Penn, at Chicago, at Yale, that kind of transformation is occurring inside higher education. Meanwhile, on the city side, what is happening? Corporate headquarters are moving out. The old sources of support are drying up. The vault is no longer present. Turn to John Hancock, which turned to that program, which was always a prominent part of the city, is now headquartered in Toronto. Instance after instance where the corporate pillars of the city, old Bank of Boston, no longer here, no longer centered here, can't turn to them anymore. The universities are still here as possible sources of partnership. At the same time, in the late 20th century, a withdrawal of federal support for other things, meaning that mayors and civic leaders were turning more to local institutions for resources that were no longer generously available from the federal government. And finally, cities began to realize more than they ever had before that actually the presence of the university brought many positive things to the life of the community. I think the most fascinating example of this phenomenon is Emerson College, because those of you who are up from Boston know that Emerson College, motivated by the old separatist tradition, said, let's move out to Lawrence, or then move up to the New Hampshire border. They were going to have a big green campus. They were going to become a traditional university. And they actually, I think, bought land, or they were about to buy land. They were all set to do it. And then somebody said, hey, wait a minute, this is not such a great idea, because we love the city, and the students love the city, and why do we want to be out, in the countryside when we're all about communications and technology and the life of the city? And so they changed course. They brought in a new president. And the city said, why don't you take over the south side of the common, which is looking terrible and going nowhere in a hurry. And so the city actually invites Emerson, as I understand the story, the city actually invites Emerson to take over buildings, build some new buildings on the south side of the common, which we all know who've lived in Boston for long periods of time is, a very kind of decrepit place, not much life. as a way of bringing back life to the city. And you know what? It has. It brings consuming energy, it brings retail, it brings life, it brings light, it brings energy, and that can be an engine of development. Well, that is a completely new mentality, I think, in terms of urban planning, and the old notion that universities would be viewed as institutions that take land off the tax rolls, and therefore a problem in terms of economic development. So what you have developing is a coming together. Universities starting to see that their interest lay in partnering with their urban settings, not with separating themselves from them. And cities, in that same way, a partnership could have tremendous benefits from the point of view of the city, that the partnership could be a real, that the university could be a real engine of development and growth for the city. And so that new partnership produces a kind of phenomenon that the University of Pennsylvania represents. Now let me just say a word, if I'm not taking too long, guys, stop me if I'm going on too long. Just a word about how this is playing out at Northeastern, because I am just so terribly proud of what this university has done and what my good friend and colleague, Bluestone, has been doing in leading the charge in this. But Northeastern, as I mentioned, growing out of this urban tradition, but in recent times transforming itself, as it has successfully, into quite a selective institution with national reach, drawing students from all over the country and indeed all over the world, but still very much at its core wanting to be part of the life of the city, because that's where we began, has joined this movement among elite, selective private universities to become this new type of institution. What does that mean operationally for university? It means that in admissions policies at Northeastern University, our aspiration has been to admit more graduates of the Boston Public Schools than any other private university in the city, and to offer them more financial aid than any other private university in the city. And both those things have been true, to my knowledge, in the recent past. They were true at the time I left the presidency. What does it mean in undergraduate education? It means that you view the city as a tremendous resource for undergraduate education. So if you look across the Northeastern curriculum, you'll find course after course after course in which the students get out into the city. I hope in a collaborative spirit with neighborhoods, and not in the spirit of examining them through a microscope. We understand the importance of that, but we also see what a rich resource for learning the city can be. Everything from the Museum of Fine Arts to neighborhood projects to working with small business. Northeastern has connected its community development activities, its physical development activities with community development issues. So when we needed to build residence halls, as we desperately did, as part of this transformation to a more selective and national institution that we went through, we needed land to do that. How did we do that? We did that through a partnership with the city. The old Southwest corridor, which had been cleared out during Frank Sargent's time, and then that highway was never built, and nothing was happening on it for 40 years. The city said to us, we'll make that land available to you to build some residence halls, but you've got to use half the land to build affordable housing. So we put together a package and we did it. We built, I think, one of the largest affordable housing projects at that time under the mayor's administration, and the university got 600 beds out of the deal. We were happy, the city was happy, the community was happy. It was a great example of a partnership. Same thing with what we call Renaissance Park. Remember the old Registry of Motor Vehicle buildings, the sick building that Mike Dukakis built in Roxbury in order to put the Registry of Motor Vehicles there that brings state energy into the redevelopment of Roxbury. It turned out to be a physical disaster because it was an air quality problem. Nobody wanted to go there. The state couldn't get anybody to move into it. It got sold at bankruptcy. We bought it. We cleaned up the air. We turned it into an office building.